Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com. Welcome to the Haydn Symphony Crusade. I mean, a crusade. Doesn't that sound like fun? We're going to crusade our way through the Haydn symphonies, including A and B and the Sinfonia Concertante. That's 107 separate videos. And each symphony is going to get the attention that it deserves. That's what makes this a crusade. That's the difference between a crusade and the Bach cantata schlepp. The Bach cantata schlepp is a schlepp because there's twice as many cantatas as there are Haydn symphonies. So getting through them all is going to be a real schlepp. But this is a crusade also because, unlike the Bach cantatas, which everybody assumes are magnificent, profound works, even if nobody ever listens to them, Haydn symphonies need a little special pleading, especially the early ones, because Haydn has never gotten the same degree of acclaim or attention that Mozart or Beethoven got, never mind the fact that nothing they wrote would be what it was had it not been for Haydn. I mean, he really sort of invented the forms and style of music that they took on and also developed even further in some respects. Some, not all. And that's the point I want to make. We're going to listen to these symphonies with an ear towards understanding what made Haydn Haydenesque, what makes him special, what makes him as great as anything that came after, and more important historically than anything that came after, because he is the fount from which the classical style as we know it and the symphonic style as we know it originally sprung. Did I say that right? Sprang, well, I don't know. He's where it came from. That's the bottom line, right? And we're going to show how he is the source of so much that came later. So much, even in these early works. So we're starting with Symphony Number 1. And the first thing that you need to know about Symphony Number 1 is that it really is Symphony Number 1. The chronology of all the Haydn symphonies is between number 1 and until we get to like the 80s is all messed up. I mean, we know roughly when some of them were written. Some of them are actually dated, but especially the first few dozen, they're all jumbled. And so this cannot be a chronological survey. But it just so happens, miracle of miracles, Symphony Number 1 really is number 1 because Haydn kept a catalog of his stuff, and we knew at least what he thought he wrote, and roughly when he wrote it. And so we do know that Symphony Number 1 is his first symphony, and a remarkable work it really is. Even though it's quite brief, it's delightful. It's short. It's only about 13-14 minutes long, in 3 movements, and it's quite a remarkable start on a voyage that would be like absolutely no other, except for what Haydn did in string quartets and piano sonatas and piano trios and, Haydn generally. But let's talk about the first symphony in a little bit more detail. The first thing we need to know is that there is no such thing as an immature Haydn symphony. There are early ones and later ones, chronologically speaking, but Haydn was nearly 30 at the time he started writing symphonies. He was 27, 28 when he wrote his first symphony. So he wasn't a young guy. He was already a tremendously experienced, grown-up composer. The difference between early Haydn and late Haydn is that the language of music changed. And he was the guy who changed it. That's the point. Initially, he had to begin somewhere. He took what existed, the Viennese symphonic style as it existed in the late 1750s, and ran with it. And after that, it was never going to be the same. But we have to start with what he started with, and that was music as he found it. So what was a symphony around 1758? That's the question we need to answer, and then we can talk about what Haydn starts to do with it. So the symphony in 1758 grew out of the Italian Sinfonia, which is basically an operatic overture in 3 movements: fast, slow, fast. That's basically all there is to it. That's the kind of stuff that people were writing and calling symphonies. And all of the movements in Haydn's symphonies at this stage, in this first symphony particularly, have the same basic form. It's an embryonic version of what later became codified, not necessarily by Haydn, by people way later, as sonata form. That is a principal theme or subject or group of themes. They're defined not so much by whether it's a tune or a melody, but what key they occupy, followed by a subsidiary group of ideas in another key. Then there's a development section, and then there's a repetition of the initial stuff, all of which stays in the same key so as to create a feeling of finality. That is what all of these movements do, and they do it on a very, very small scale. We have to recall, Haydn wrote these symphonies for one of his first employers, Count Morzin by name, who had an orchestra of which he was quite fond, and these were intended as pleasing and enjoyable divertissements. They are not supposed to be big, profound, heavy statements. They become that, and they become that in Haydn's hands. But for now, what he's trying to do is put a smile on your face and give a little spring to your step and get your toe tapping, and to do it in a way that engages you both emotionally and intellectually by hearing what the music actually does with the material that it employs. And that's where Haydn is special, because Haydn was the guy who figured out how to work with themes and make something out of nothing, literally, quite amazingly so. But there's another issue that we need to talk about what happens in these symphonies in Haydn's hands, and that is something called the principal affect rule, the single affect rule. Now, the single affect rule was an aesthetic theory common in the Baroque period and the early classical period, which said that a movement, a chunk of music, could only express one predominant emotion. You should not mix them up, because if you mix them up, you get incoherence as a result. The sonata style that Haydn invented, basically, discovered ways to break that rule. The first guy to do it was C.P.E. Bach, who was one of Haydn's principal models. C.P.E. Bach learned how to change emotions literally every other bar, and the result sometimes does sound incoherent. I don't think so. I think it's just fun to listen to. But the risk is that the whole thing is going to fall apart because nothing relates to anything else, and because there's no consistency of mood, and also because these pieces are not terribly long. And so if you're changing the mood and the affect every few bars, it's going to be just a bewildering jumble of effects that seem to have no relation to one another. And this is what Haydn learned how to rationalize and create in a much more sort of formally inventive and expressively intense way. The key to all of this, the key to whether you have one affect or 50 affects, is timing. It's how much time you spend with each emotion or mood that you want to express, how much variety you pack into your subjects, into your ideas, and into the movements, and how you work with them. Haydn figured out how essentially to move from any mood he wanted, any emotional state, any level of expressive intensity, while still maintaining musical coherence all the way through, while giving you a really satisfying feeling that you have successfully embarked on and returned from a musical journey, an experience. That was Haydn's gift. And what made it possible is the fact that he had the best musical timing of anybody in the business. He really, really did. And again, these works are going to show us how he began to do that. So let's start with the First Symphony. The first movement, it's in 3 movements, fast, slow, fast. It begins with a dazzling crescendo, which was a new effect back in those days. It was the specialty of the Mannheim Orchestra, and Haydn didn't use it very often. But to begin the First Symphony with this big crescendo, and off it goes, and you just can't help but feel that somewhere in the back of his brain, he may have realized, where things were going to go. We can't prove it. I mean, there's no point, but it's fun to speculate, and the music almost begs that kind of interpretation. I'm going to play the entire exposition for you. And in these kinds of pieces and movements in sonata form, the exposition really consists of two kinds of music. And I talk about this in my talk on sonata form, which I suggest you watch if you like. It's basically very simple. As I said, there are the themes, or subjects as they're called, that define a key area, a location, a certain feeling that's engendered by being in that location. And then there's what I call motion music, the music that is transitional, that modulates, that moves from one place to another. It's motion music because you're going from one place to another place, musically speaking. And it's the motion music where a lot of the most interesting stuff happens in Haydn's symphonies, not just the actual themes or tunes that define a subject, because the motion music is going to be very, very active in the development section and in other places. And in the recapitulation, the restatement of these initial themes, all of that's going to change. They're not going to be the same when they come back because they're not going to change key. So that means the music that took you from one place to another can't do that anymore. It either has to stay in the same place or something else has to happen. And being attuned to that something else is one of the keys that unlocks the whole sort of expressive ambience of a Haydn symphonic movement. So I'm going to play you the entire exposition, and I'm going to put on top of the exposition what each bit represents. And I'm also going to tell you what bit is going to be important for the development section. And then we'll take it from there. So first, I want to say we're going to be listening to the Haydn symphonies, predominantly from the Naxos Complete Symphony Editions, which has some marvelous, marvelous performances. For the First Symphony, we have Patrick Galois conducting the Sinfonia Finlandia Uvescula. Uvescula. That's what it is. It's a Uvescula, maybe. I don't care. I'm calling it Symphonia Finlandia because I don't know what a Uvescula is or if I've pronounced it correctly. So we'll call it Symphonia Finlandia. With Patrick Galois. Here we go. Here's the exposition. Have a listen. Pay attention. Listen carefully. So there it is, lively, charming, delightful. The important thing, I think, is to notice just how much stuff Haydn packs into this, like 50 seconds of music. It's so compressed, but you've got loud things, soft things, lyrical bits, rhythmic bits. You have the second subject in a minor key, which provides maximum contrast. It's lots of stuff. But the important thing to note is that in the journey to the second subject and the second subject itself, we hear a little teeny three-note motive. Da-da-dum, ba-ba-dum, da-da-dum. It's like that. Do-do-do-do, ba-ba-dum, da-da-dum. That's all it is. It's a little bit of nothing. That is going to be what is going to comprise most of the development section. And so now what I want to do is I'm going to play the development and the whole recapitulation. Because, in all of these sonata movements, they basically have two sections. A exposition, which is repeated, and a development/recapitulation, which is also repeated. So the form is AABB in these pieces. And you can either do the repeats or not do the repeats. These performances do the repeats. Period instrument people always do repeats. Some people take the first repeat and not the second. There's all kinds of options with repeats. But the point is that you can hear the entire development and recapitulation. And so I want you to listen now to the development, paying special attention to that little bit I pointed out as development material in hearing the exposition. Listen to what Haydn does. Now, you may have noticed, or you may not have noticed, that when the initial material comes back, it does not go somewhere else, but stays close to home. One of the textbook things about sonata form is they say, well, everything's recapitulated in the home key. Now, that isn't true. That's not what happens. What happens is that it's recapitulated and recomposed in such a way so as to reaffirm the home key. That means, if it does go someplace else, it's got to stay close. It's got to go in a way that's going to come back quickly. And that's what happens here. It happens by Haydn eliminating the motion music, the original motion music that took us to that second key, and simply jumping from the first subject to the second subject to the end, so that it all sounds like one more continuous block of music without any digression or diversion. And here I've separated out the motion music that gets left out in the recapitulation. It's only like 10 seconds, 15 seconds of music, because we're dealing with short pieces on a tiny scale. But here is the motion music that Haydn leaves out. You see? So if you want to hear, go back and listen to the whole thing again or play it yourself, you can hear that he's compressed the recapitulation because, first of all, it isn't necessary to modulate. And second of all, because the development section has contained a lot of working with similar material. And you don't need to go through it again. You've had a passage of modulation and instability which has been regularized or stabilized by the recapitulation. And that's the first movement. And I think the thing to keep in mind is just how many little ideas there are in it. They're very brief, they're very small. You don't have big, long romantic tunes, but what you have is a maximum amount of variety in a very, very small space. Now, the slow movement is an andante. It's in exactly the same form, A, B, B, in sonata form. And now that you know how to listen to sonata form, you listen for the motives and the ideas that the exposition has, which will determine what happens in the rest of the movement, basically. I'm just going to play the exposition. And I want you to just listen to it for what it is. And we don't have to do any more. It tells you what the movement is. But what I would ask you to listen for is just the amazing amount of variety that even here in this tiny little piece, Haydn builds into the music. It's a constant kaleidoscope of rhythms. And you've got syncopated rhythms. You've got minor keys. You've got all kinds of different contrasts of texture, from a simple, quiet melody to unison statements. All of these things are there to try and create as much variety as possible in a very, very small space. So here is the opening exposition of the Andante central movement. It's just charming. That's the only reason it has for its existence. We are not at the point where we have tragic slow movements or deep, deep, dark emotions or religious ecstasy or any of the other things that Haydn was going to show that music can do. At the moment, his purpose is to charm. And that's what it does. Now, the finale is like the first movement, only even shorter. It's only 2 minutes long in AABB. So that should tell you right away with a development section. So Haydn is writing on a very, very small scale, as did all composers of the 1750s when writing symphonies. This is what a symphony was. But what makes Haydn different in this finale, I think, we hear some qualities that immediately say that we're listening to Haydn. So I'm going to play you the music first, and then let's talk about what those qualities are. Here is the exposition, which is only 20 seconds long, of the entire finale. It's only 20 seconds, but doesn't it just sound catchy and wonderful? This was one of Haydn's gifts. He had the ability to write music in almost a folk style, but it was a folk style that wasn't clumsy and wasn't sort of dumbed down music. It's actually very, very sophisticated because as you hear, the tune is this rollicking, it's almost like a sea shanty, right? Bum 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 ba da dum ba dum bum 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 ba da dum ba dum. But then ba da ba da ba da ba ba da ba da ba da ba da ba da and it goes off. That's the point. The melody does not do what you think it's supposed to do. You would expect it to be two symmetrically balanced phrases, right? Bum 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 ba da dum ba dum bum ba dum bum 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 ba da dum ba dum bum 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 bum. I mean, that's what like a well-balanced folk tune would do. But Haydn doesn't do that. He extends it. He cuts it off and extends it in a way which is completely unexpected and that carries the music off. It makes you listen forward. It makes you listen compulsively to where it's going. That was one of Haydn's gifts. That and the sort of outdoors that fresh, lively quality to the music that's really, it's indefinable. It's a melodic quality, and, musicology does not have a way to explain how composers do that. But Haydn always did that. He was a country style composer, just the opposite of Mozart. Mozart was absolutely urban. There is nothing Mozart writes that sounds like it's happening outdoors. Haydn sounds like he's always outdoors somewhere. And that sort of rollicking sea shanty is a perfect 20-second example of what's going to make Haydn's music so special. The ability to be at once popular sounding, but also extremely sophisticated, and to take these popular elements and spin out large forms with them. I mean, a 2-minute long finale isn't exactly a large form yet, but it's going to become that way. That's what's going to happen to it. For the moment, we only need to hear just that delightful 20 seconds of music to know everything we need to know about where Haydn is going to go as a composer. And so that is the first installment of our Haydn Crusade. Next up will be Symphony number 2, and we only have 105 more to go. At least, unlike the Bach cantata Schlepp, I don't have to do it every Sunday. I'm not going to do those every Sunday either, but, we can do these anytime we want, and maybe we'll finish it sooner. I don't know. I'm not going to rush, and you shouldn't rush either, because one of the most important things, and I can't stress this enough, is that because there is no such thing as immature Haydn, there's no reason to brush by these early works. They need to be savored, just like the late works. They have content. They have intellectual substance. They have expressive substance. They are constantly engaging. They are worthy of repetition. The tendency is, because they're short and, written for small ensembles, this one's only written for strings, 2 oboes, 2 horns, and if you want, optionally, a continuo part, which could have a harpsichord, a bassoon, a cello, something like that. Because they're brief and early, and no one has time for anything except, a tiny handful of late works with nicknames attached to them, like the Surprise Symphony, the Military Symphony. We ignore them. They get ignored, and they shouldn't be ignored. And that's why I'm devoting a talk to each one, and that's why I'm going to spend as much time on them as I will on some of the later ones, because they deserve your attention. They are worthy of your attention, and that is the purpose of this crusade. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you for joining me. I hope we're together for years doing this. It's going to be a blast. I guarantee it. Take care.